Dear friends, it is the National Gallery, London. This National Gallery curator, the director is from our parish, Gabriele Finaldi. Gabriele took us around in this National Gallery. There we find the exhibition of St Francis. So that's what we are going to show now. It is really amazing. I invite you all to come and see this exhibition and be inspired to follow Jesus Christ as St Francis did in his life.
He felt very close to nature. He didn't say nature, he said creation. He had a view of the natural world being something that God had created and that was there for us to rejoice in, for us to be part of, for us to look after. And of course, many of you will know that Pope Francis recently wrote an encyclical called Laudato Si, which is the words of the song that St Francis composed about creation and about praising God for all the beautiful things that he's made. And there he talks about Francis's example, Francis's inspiration, that we should all have a sense of care and love towards what he refers to as our common home. So Francis is often seen in our time as the sort of patron saint or protector of the created world, the environment, you could say. And so right from the start of the show, we wanted to kind of allude to that with this green wall here. So these are mosses and plants that you will find in central Italy, where St Francis comes from. And you can actually smell that this is a kind of living presence right from the very first moment. And I'm very pleased to say that we've thought very carefully about how all the different bits of the show can then have an afterlife once the exhibition is closed. And you might be interested to know that this living wall here will be cut into sections and will be taken to a hospital in Kent for mental health. So bits of the Francis show will have an afterlife in other places, sometimes in schools, in hospitals, and I'm very pleased that all that's sort of built in to the Francis exhibition. But please follow me, Francis, so that you can sort of locate where he fits in history. So Francis is born in 1181, and he's born in Assisi, which is central Italy. There's a map there, that's the middle of Italy, and you can just see Assisi here. Rome is down here, so that gives you an idea. If you're travelling by car, it's probably about 2 hours from Rome. He's born in 1181, and he dies in 1226, so quite young. He dies in his mid-40s, and in 1228 he's canonized. It's kind of record fast time for being canonized. Normally it takes a long time between your death and your canonization, but for Francis it was very, very quick indeed. So within 2 years of his death, he'd been canonized. He'd established the Franciscan order. It had grown remarkably quickly, and there were friars spread all across Europe already by the time Francis died. It's a very, very remarkable achievement that the order grew so quickly at a time when there's no railways, there's no aeroplanes, there's no telephone, there's no internet. Francis's message, which is essentially the Christian message of love and brotherhood, is being spread across Italy and beyond. Even in Britain, there were Franciscans already from the 1220s, so while Francis was still alive. In a way, that's the sort of typical image of Francis that we're familiar with. That's Francis in prayer. He's in his habit. He's in his Franciscan brown habit. He's praying with a skull in his hand, so he's meditating on the transitory nature of life. He's meditating on death. He's raising his eyes to God. There's a divine light illuminating him from above, and he's a sort of mystical Francis. But if you see this object here, this is rather different and not perhaps what you'd expect when you walk into a St Francis exhibition at the National Gallery, because this is a modern work of art. In fact, it dates from the mid-1980s, And it's a work by a very, very famous English artist called Anthony Gormley. Some of you may know something called the Angel of the North. When you approach Newcastle, there's this extraordinary object standing beside the motorway of an angel with its wings wide open. Enormous sculpture. And this is the artist who made it. Now, Anthony Gormley comes from a Catholic family. When he grew up, he says that his father recounted the stories of St Francis from the little flowers of St Francis. He grew up knowing this. What was important was to love and to care for other people, not to amass wealth and goods. And he was very inspired by this. When he worked in New York, he knew a very famous picture by an artist called Giovanni Bellini, which shows St Francis in this pose, looking up into the heavens, possibly singing. And he said he wanted to do something that recalled St Francis in that pose. There's a little reproduction of it over there on the label. And so what he did is he took a cast of his own body and he presented himself in the position of St Francis as he appears in that famous painting. And very significantly, he placed the stigmata on Francis. They're the wounds of Jesus from the crucifixion, which were visited on St Francis in 1224. We'll come to that in a moment. But he represents himself, not with any sort of clear identification of who it is. This could be anyone. But it's St Francis. And he has the stigmata in the shape of eyes, because he said, I wanted people to imagine that they could sort of look inside this figure, into the sort of spiritual interior, the spiritual darkness that lies within, and think of themselves in some way as Francis. So from the very first moment when you step into the exhibition, we want people to think of themselves in connection with Francis. He's not just a historical character from 800 years ago. He's somebody who has something to say to us today, and somebody that we can, in some sense, identify with, or aspire to, or be in admiration of, or pray to. He's somebody who is alive and present. The third thing that's important in this room is what you see on that wall there. Now, this is a brand new work of art. This was produced just 3 months ago, and this is a work by another very, very famous English artist called Sir Richard Long. Sir Richard Long is what we call a land artist. He's an artist who works in forest, and he makes works of art with stones, and he documents his journeys through deserts and so on. And he often works with very, very humble materials, slate, stones gathered up from the bed of a river, pebbles, and mud. And so we asked him from the National Gallery if he would consider doing something for the St Francis exhibition. So he proposed two things. One was to do this mud circle. So this was made with mud from the River Avon, from Bristol, the Bristol area where the artist comes from. And in some ways, it's sort of vaguely reminiscent of the sun and the moon. And remember that Francis composes this wonderful Canticle of the Creatures, which is also known as the Canticle of the Sun. But also, he wanted to be, in a sense, he wanted to be nobody. He wanted to be very humble. He often walked barefoot. He wanted to have no possessions. He was very close to the earth. And in fact, he said that when he died, he told his friars that he should be laid out on the naked earth, so he could be sort of in communion with the earth. And you know that the word humility comes from humus. Well, humus is a Latin word that means earth. So it's something earthly or close to the earth, not up here, but right down there. So making something with mud, I think, also reminds us of the humility of St Francis. And then finally, with these two word circles, but particularly this one here, he came over. This is Richard Long. He came to Assisi with me and spent a few days there. In fact, he spent a whole week on the mountain above Assisi, just living in a tent and drinking water from the stream and observing the phases of the moon and so on. And he recorded his impressions with these sort of poetic phrases, beginning with, right there at 12 o'clock, the frescoes of Giotto. Giotto is a medieval artist who painted the great frescoes in the Basilica of St Francis of Assisi, where he's buried, but also you can hear the sounds of birds cawing. He's looking at the objects in the landscape around him. Path of white stones, a large crater. He can hear barking deer. He refers to the Umbrian plain, water at Fontabregna. So he's giving you all these impressions of being in central Italy, in the area where Francis came from. I often say that if St Francis had been born in Catford, probably wouldn't have been the same sort of saint that he was, because of where he was born and where he came from and the landscape he was in. And that's very important for the art of St Francis as well. So remember, Francis is yielding, let's say, great works of art from the very moment that he dies, right up until today. So for 800 years, artists have been producing works of art inspired by St Francis. That's a very good reason to do an exhibition on him at the National Gallery. You stepped from a room which is about some contemporary responses to St Francis. You stepped into a beautiful tabernacle. You're inside a tabernacle, the Golden Tabernacle. Think of the tabernacle behind the altar in our church, and imagine being inside that. Imagine being inside a golden reliquary with a golden dome above your head. And that's where you are in this beautiful octagonal room. And this room here hosts this set of 7 paintings by a 15th century artist, so already, 2 centuries after St Francis, by an artist you probably won't have heard of him. He's called Sassetta. He's very important, and these pictures all come from the National Gallery's collection. Most of what you see doesn't come from the National Gallery, but these do come from our own collection. And they tell you the story of St Francis. So I'm going to tell you very, very simply. Okay, I said he was born in 1181 in Assisi. He was the son of basically a merchant who sold beautiful fabrics. He traded a lot with France, and that may be the reason why Francis was called Francesco. He's the first person to be called Francesco in history, and it's probably because of his father's relationship with France, although possibly his mother was French as well. We're not entirely certain. Anyway, his father had big ambitions for him. In those days, you always wanted to kind of push yourself up the social scale, up the social ladder. So if you're a merchant, you want to be a knight. If you're a servant, you want to be a merchant. If you're a merchant, you want to be a knight. And if you're a knight, you want to be a courtier, and so on. So Francis too had dreams of grandeur, and he wanted to be a soldier, and he wanted to be famous, and he wanted to be a knight, and so on. And he had dreams of greatness. And in fact, you see him here, sleeping in his bed, and he's having this dream of a castle with banners, and he thinks this is all about the great success he will have as a soldier, and the great success he'll have in terms of the worldly importance. But of course, that's not at all what God had in mind for him. In fact, there's an angel here saying, look up there, this is what lies in wait for you. And Francis assumes that that's to do with worldly glory, but of course he later realizes it's something quite different. It's really about the order that he will found and how he'll be able to serve the church. Anyway, Francis has the first stirrings of conversion one day when he's returning to Assisi, and he encounters a poor knight. Here he's barefoot, and he gets off his horse and gives him his cloak. This is sort of the first time that we see him actually having, concerns about how he should live his religious faith and so on. And little by little, his religious crisis sort of grows deeper, and he eventually realizes he has to give everything up if he really is going to follow Christ, as Christ is inviting him to follow him. So here you see, slightly later stage in the story, Francis by this stage has had an encounter with Christ in the form of a painted crucifix, where Christ has spoken to him from the crucifix and says to him, Francis, look at my church. It's in a ruinous state. Rebuild my church. Well, if you have somebody say that to you, you think, what the heck is going on? There's something wrong with me, I need to go to the doctor. But he says, okay, I need to rebuild the church. So he starts rebuilding the broken down church in which he had this vision, which is a church called San Damiano. And again, later on, he realizes that this calling to rebuild the church is not about rebuilding the physical church. It's about something much deeper and more profound and more significant. But in order to buy the stones he needs to rebuild his church of San Damiano, what he does is he goes off and starts selling his father's precious silks and velvets in a little town not far away from Assisi called Foligno. He also sells his horse. Well, his dad's not very pleased about this. He already thinks his son is sort of, a bit of a hippie and a bit of a troublemaker. And then to discover that he starts selling off the family wealth in order to rebuild the church upsets him very greatly. And he drags the boy in front of the Bishop of Assisi and demands justice from the Bishop of Assisi against his own son, that his son should make reparation. At this point, Francis sees that this is a moment where he needs to make a decision. Do I go with my own father, or do I go for the Father in heaven who's calling me to a completely different kind of life? And so he chooses at this point. He takes off all his clothes, he undresses completely naked in front of everyone in the square in Assisi, and he places his clothes at the feet of his father, gives him back everything that his father had given him. He says, I want nothing from you. He says, you are no longer my father. I only have one father, and that is my Father in heaven. Very, very tough, very radical, very shocking. This is what Francis is like. We think of him as very sweet, very romantic, but he's very tough saint. The bishop covers him with his cloak, covers his nakedness with his cloak, but that too becomes symbolic of Francis sort of abandoning his worldly life, his worldly ambitions, his earthly family, and sort of being taken on in this new family, which is the church. Remember, Francis never became a priest. He considered himself completely unworthy to be a priest. He took minor orders. He was a deacon, but he never became a priest. Instead, he set up this kind of band of brothers, this kind of ragtag mob of young men who wanted to follow Jesus in a radical way. And that's what you see in this picture. They've already started wearing their brown Franciscan habits, and they've gone to Rome to get approval for the kind of life that they want to live. Francis was immensely concerned with obedience to the Pope and respect for priests. If you read the text of the Franciscan rule, those things come up very, very close to the beginning. Love for the Pope, obedience to the Pope, and respect for priests. In fact, there's a famous story where Francis is being goaded as he makes his way around central Italy, and people want to see how he's going to react about a priest living in the next village who's in an adulterous relationship with a woman, and they want to see what Francis is going to do about it. So Francis goes to visit the man, and the first thing he does is he kneels down before him and he kisses his hands, because these are the hands that consecrate the bread and wine every day at Mass. So he's completely non-judgmental, and as part of that rule of St Francis, the rule of the Franciscans, immense respect for ordained priests. Right, let's carry on with the story. So Francis, in 1219, goes to Egypt with the Fifth Crusade. At this time, the Holy Land has fallen into the hands of the Muslims. It's not possible for Christian pilgrims to go to the holy places, to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, and so on. So the Crusades, the sort of Christian kingdoms of Europe, send out forces to try and recapture the holy places so that Christian pilgrims can go and visit them. Francis accompanies the Fifth Crusade and heads for Egypt. When he's in Egypt, he meets the Sultan of Egypt, and in an encounter which should have been a hostile encounter between two religions that were at war with one another, Francis's meeting is very courteous, very respectful, and a great deal of understanding between the Sultan, the Muslim Sultan, and the Christian Francis emerges. This is considered very remarkable at the time. In paintings, Sassetta shows the moment where Francis offers to do a trial by fire. I'll show you how deep and authentic my faith is because I'm prepared to walk through fire. In the end, that didn't actually happen, but Francis seems to have offered to do the trial by fire, which was one of the ways in which, in medieval times, you could prove your commitment. So that's Francis in Egypt, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And this is Francis with the wolf. Most people know the story of Francis and the wolf. Francis brings about the conversion, if you like, of the wolf of Gubbio. Here he is, the wolf of Gubbio, the ferocious wolf of Gubbio. He's been behaving horrendously because he's been eating some of the inhabitants of the town of Gubbio. You can see bits of limbs lying along the forest path there, and there's bones strewn along the path through the forest. And the people are afraid of this terrifying monster. And Francis goes out into the forest to look for him and has a dialogue with the wolf, talks to the wolf. Francis speaks to animals, it's extraordinary. They speak to him, he can understand them. And he comes to an agreement, he makes a pact with the wolf, and he says, the townspeople will provide for you, but you must promise not to attack them or to hurt them. So the deal is struck. Francis shakes the paw of the wolf, as you can see here. That's the deal. Just to ratify it, he's got a lawyer to write it down on a piece of paper. So there's no doubts about everyone's commitment. And then, of course, the wolf becomes a sort of adopted citizen of the town of Gubbio. So once again, it's a beautiful, romantic story. Francis' love for animals brings about this reconciliation between the ferocious wolf and the townspeople of Gubbio. But fundamentally, it's about Francis' vocation and his calling to bring peace, to bring reconciliation between enemies, between warring parties. And of course, sometimes in church we sing, "Make me a channel of your peace," don't we? Which are words that come from St Francis. That's what the story is really about. It's not so much about his love of wolves. It's about bringing about peace and reconciliation between enemies. And Francis does that through the course of his life. Finally, over here, in 1224, 2 years before Francis dies, he goes up into the wilderness on the mountains near Arezzo in central Italy. And while he's there, at this stage, he's still a young man, he's 42 years old, but his health is very poor. He's almost lost his eyesight, his kidneys are in a terrible state, he suffers from horrendous stomach pains. But he goes into the wilderness to pray, to be alone with his most devoted friend, his brother Leo, who appears over here. And while he's on Mount Laverna, he has a vision of a figure on a cross covered with wings, the six-winged angel, which is known as a seraph. So he has a seraphic vision of Christ on the cross. The seraphic Christ is referred to as. And after he has this vision, in the middle of the night, this is a night scene, he finds that the wounds of Christ, stigmata as they're called, have been visited on his own body. So from that moment, he has the stigmata on his own body, the wounds in his hands, feet, and side. And you can see the artist has shown Francis with his palms raised, and you can see the wounds on his hands. You can just see the wound in his side there, and it's on his feet as well. So this had never happened before. This was the first time in history that anyone had received the stigmata. As you know, subsequently there have been other manifestations of the stigmata on saintly people and so on, including Padre Pio, for example. But from this moment on, of course, Francis is sort of revered as somebody who has an extraordinarily close relationship with Christ. In fact, very early on, shortly after he dies, he's referred to as Francis Alter Christus. Those of you who know Latin know that means Francis another Christ, or Francis the second Christ. Okay, so that total conformity, that's the kind of technical word he used, total conformity of Francis to Christ because of how he lives his life, totally at the service of others, totally devoted to God, manifests itself physically on his own body through the stigmata. And the stigmatization of Francis is the scene that you'll probably see most often in representations of Francis. That's really the key image of St Francis. St Francis is having this mystical experience where he receives the stigmata on his own body. And of course he carries those right through to his death. He hides them there. You know, it's sort of intimate and private. It's something to do with his own personal relationship with Christ. But people get to hear about it, of course. And when he dies, this is the last scene in the story, the stigmata are proved. In other words, they're examined and it's declared that they are truly there on his body, because you can imagine there was a lot of confusion, a lot of rumour around this extraordinary event that had taken place. And it's in this church here, which becomes San Francesco, the Sacro Convento, the Holy Convent of Assisi, which, if those of you who've been to, who's been to Assisi actually? Has anyone been to Assisi? Yeah, there's dozen hands raised here. So those of you who've been to Assisi will know that there's the Sacro Convento, the great basilica where he's buried, make pilgrimage to receive graces from St Francis to express their devotion and so on. Right, so that gives you a sense of the kind of story of St Francis, you know, from this ambitious merchant son to this servant of God to stigmata, to his death and burial in Assisi. So, what happens next? Come through here. Within 2 years, the earliest representation we have of St Francis is in a Benedictine monastery called the Sacro Specchio in central Italy, where he's identified as Frate Francisco, which means Brother Francis. So on that basis you can be fairly confident that that image dates from before his canonization, otherwise he'd be Saint Francis. So if Francis dies in 26, this is probably 27, 28 is the canonization. So images of Francis are being produced immediately after he dies. And of course, part of the success of Francis and the Franciscans is not just the growth of the order itself, the preaching of the Franciscans across Europe and into North Africa, but also the image making of St Francis. So the Franciscans bring the sort of experience and the spirituality of Francis, the love of nature, the service to other people, the freedom from worldly possessions and power, but they also bring images of Francis with them. And Francis has so many episodes in his life which are wonderfully susceptible to representation, make beautiful pictures and images. Other saints don't have such an interesting story, let's say. So Francis' very interesting stories are very good for painters. So here you have Francis appearing as what we call the sort of cult image, and he's sort of turned into a Byzantine saint. Can you see the characteristics of his face? He's got a very kind of drawn face, a very large skull, very serious. These are the typical characteristics of a Byzantine saint. And then around the saint are shown scenes from his life, all posthumous miracles, because remember that when the case is being made for you to become a saint, it's the posthumous miracles that matter, the ones that happen after you've died. So there are several miracles identified here, which are the ones that were, as it were, presented as part of the cause for canonization. Okay? I'm presuming that you know a lot of the language that I'm using because you're Catholics. I think other people wouldn't necessarily understand some of the things that I'm talking about, but you do understand that. So here's, for example, a woman who's being liberated from a demon. You can see that her hair is disheveled, her clothes are torn, she's showing her nakedness. And here, coming out of her mouth, is this black demon. Can you see it? And this is happening over the tomb of St Francis, which sits just underneath the altar in Assisi. So these are miracles associated with St Francis. Here he is, the healing of a cripple. Here he is with his stick, he can't walk, and here he is once he's been healed. Okay, so this comes from the Sacro Convento, from the Holy Convent of St Francis in Assisi, and according to tradition, the wooden panel on which this picture has been painted was a panel that was laid out on the floor, and Francis was laid on it shortly before being buried. So it has sort of semi-relic status as well, and it's very extraordinary that, that this has been lent to us. But there are more miracles ahead, bigger than this one, I assure you. Here's another early example. So this is from the middle of the 13th century. These are very, very old things. In fact, both of these paintings are older than anything in the National Gallery. We started our collection of pictures from the sort of 1260s and later on, whereas these date from even earlier. So once again, it's very remarkable that they've been lent to us. That comes from Assisi. This comes from a town in Tuscany called Pistoia. It comes from a Franciscan church there. And then over here we have some manuscripts as well. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but just to say that we've got two autographed manuscripts by St Francis, two things that he wrote with his own hand, which have come down to us, which is pretty amazing. One is a blessing which he's written out for Brother Leo, and he's even made a little drawing. Do you want to know what Francis drew like? Well, this is a drawing by him. So you can just make out there's a head here seen in profile, and from the mouth of this head comes the cross, the Tau cross, the shape, which is like a T, which was the cross that Francis used and which he instructed his followers to use as well. So this is probably the head of Adam. Do you remember sometimes when you see a crucifixion scene, you see a skull at the bottom of the crucifix? Well, that's normally the skull of Adam, and the cross sort of emerges from the skull of Adam. So Adam represents man who has died, and Christ represents the new Adam who has brought salvation to humankind. So that's a blessing that he writes for Brother Leo. And then there's a tiny, tiny manuscript over there, which is a letter that he writes to Brother Leo, and that's preserved in the cathedral at Spoleto. Now, both of these, I'm afraid, are facsimiles. They're not the original documents because they wouldn't lend them to us. But we do have some other manuscripts, and I particularly wanted to highlight this one here because this takes us to England in the sort of 1240s. Okay, so we're in the 13th century. Francis has already sent his friars to England. He'd send them out 2 by 2 to preach the gospel to France, to Germany, to Spain, and to England. And the Franciscan province here in England grew very, very quickly. It was a very, very important province in the early period. Lots of vocations in England in the 13th and 14th centuries. Anyway, this book here, it's a big fat book. This is real, okay? This is a real 13th century manuscript. It's a history of the world. That's what they used to write in those days. Written by a Benedictine monk from St Albans, north of London. And this Benedictine monk writes the history of the world from creation right up to the present. Well, the present is the 1240s. But towards the end of the story, he recounts the appearance of St Francis. And St Francis as a sort of providential figure who comes with a new message of hope and renewal for the whole world. And he draws in the margins 2 little drawings, one of the stigmatization of St Francis. So it's exactly the same scene we saw before in the Sassetta painting. Yeah, Francis is receiving a stigmata from this angelic apparition of Jesus. And then down here he is praying, preaching to the birds. So the stigmatization and the preaching to the birds are the scenes that you'll most frequently see, actually, in the iconography, in the imagery of St Francis. Right, let's carry on. Goodness. Time with St Francis. It's very interesting. They emphasize his preaching and they emphasize his miracles. Okay, so it's the miracle-making Francis that gets put into pictures. Well, as time passes, you get different sorts of images of Francis being created because, in a way, there are different aspects of Francis that is convenient to emphasize at different times. Okay, so when we get to the 16th century, which is a time of a lot of religious conflict and so on, Francis gets sort of taken up as the Francis of the mystical experiences, Francis who has direct communion with God, Francis who's an example of prayer. Rather than an example of giving things away to the poor, he becomes a different sort of example. And the pictures reflect this, okay? So you're seeing the stigmatization of Francis here, this intense religious experience on top of Mount Laverna. There he is praying in the middle of the night, and this angelic Christ appears in the sky, that sort of glowing bubble that you can see up on the right-hand side. But also you get the representation of Francis, which is not directly inspired by the stories of his life, but you get a sort of spiritual representation of Francis. So here's Francis embracing Christ on the cross, and Christ bringing his arm down from the crossbeam of the cross and embracing St Francis. So there's this sort of embrace between the Saviour and Jesus himself, and this wonderful sort of look of love in both directions. Francis is beautiful sort of gaze of devotion and love towards Christ, and Christ with a sort of brotherly, caring love towards Francis. In fact, Francis is bringing his lips close to the side wound, which of course is the origin of the Eucharist. But also, note what he's doing with his foot. He's not kicking a beach ball. He's actually putting his foot on the globe of the world, which represents his victory over earthly ambitions, over the desire for power and wealth. And in fact, in order to understand this gesture here, sort of stepping on the globe of the earth, or kicking it away even, that might be what's intended, is you need to go diagonally through the picture and look at the book that the angels are holding. And if you know Latin, which I know most of you do, it says there, I'm going to translate it for you. He who does not reject or renounce everything he owns cannot be my disciple. Yeah. And it's a quotation from the Gospel of St Luke. Yeah. This is the man who knows every quotation from the Bible. But this is Luke, in particular, Luke chapter 7. And you can see that that's related to what he's doing. So he is renouncing every desire for possessions, every desire for power, every desire for status or prestige, and is kicking this away in order to be able to serve God, in order to be able to love Christ. That's what the picture is about. It's a symbolic representation. And it's by an artist called Murillo, who's one of my favourite painters, who comes from southern Spain, very close to where my wife comes from. And it comes from Seville, from the Capuchin Church in Seville. It's one of the great pictures in the museum in Seville. And once again, we've been very fortunate that Seville has agreed to lend this to us. It's not a picture that they lend at all often. And then finally in this room, on this wall here, the great Caravaggio, the artist, the great Caravaggio, his earliest known religious picture. Caravaggio is always immensely original when he represents religious subjects. What you're seeing here is Francis after the stigmatization. He's completely exhausted after this very intense spiritual experience, which is exhausted him both spiritually, mentally, and physically. And what you see here is an angel has come to comfort him, rather like what happens in the Gospel after Jesus in the Garden of Olives has suffered this moment of extreme anguish. An angel comes to comfort him. So the stories of Christ are being projected onto St Francis. Francis, who we already know is an alter Christus. So he's being represented to us as though he were somebody extremely, intensely close to Christ in the way he lives, in the way he experiences. Tells the story with all the details and so on. Here, Umberto is sort of inviting us to become part of Francis's experience. He invites us to kind of have that mystical encounter with Christ together with him. It's almost as if we're being drawn up into the sky together with Francis. Look at Francis' big eye looking up towards the apparition. And of course, we more or less proceeded sort of chronologically, through to the 17th century. From here on, the exhibition becomes more thematic. And this room is devoted to Francis and nature. or Francis and creation, as he would have said. Francis wasn't especially romantic about animals and about birds. He had a poetic spirit. I mean, Francis was a poet, he was a singer, he was a dancer. He encouraged his friars to be joyful. He composed music. He may have played some kind of musical instrument. He may have played the lute or some kind of stringed instrument. Most of his prayer and praise was done in sung form, and the Franciscans, of course, have carried on that tradition of joy and song and sung praise and so on. He viewed nature as the creation of God, and looking at the beauty of nature, looking at the harmony of nature, looking at the variety of nature, this led him to praise God. It's not that he was praising nature. Some people think that Francis was praising nature. He was praising God for having created nature that spoke to him about God. And this is a little bit what we're trying to show in this room. Shortly before he died, he wrote the famous Canticle of the Sun, which we've transcribed here on the wall. And I'm just going to read a little bit. Canticle of the Sun. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honour, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no human is worthy to mention your name. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir, Brother, Son. He refers to created things as his brothers and his sisters, all part of this big created family that God has made, who is the day and through whom you give us light, and he is beautiful and radiant with great splendour, and bears a likeness to you, Most High One. Praise be you, you might recognise that phrase, Laudato Si, which is the Italian or medieval Italian for praise be you, is the title of Pope Francis' encyclical, Laudato Si. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praise be you, my Lord, through brother wind, and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather, through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Well, we sing this in a variety of different forms in the various hymns and songs that we sing in church and so on. So even though it's a poem dating from 800 years ago, it's still present in our practice and in our religious vocabulary. This artist here, who's an artist called Costa, he actually wanted to show Francis praying this prayer. So he's shown him with his arms raised, looking out towards the valley where Assisi is placed, the mountain above Assisi, Mount Subasio. This is called the Umbrian Valley. And while he looks out across the valley, up into the skies, he's singing this song here. So it's a picture with a soundtrack. It's a picture where Francis is sort of, giving his full, with all his effort. He's singing the praises of God. So as you look around, you'll see the birds. In fact, you might even have heard some of the birds. These are birds from central Italy that we recorded especially for this exhibition. You see Francis preaching to the birds. Different sorts of birds. You see they're all arranged like a sort of hierarchy, like the civil service. And these different birds are often birds that are hostile to each other. So once again, just like with the wolf of Gubbio, Francis preaching to the birds is about the birds listening in peace and harmony and being together as they listen to the preaching about the love of God. And then you can see in two English paintings, this one here, Francis surrounded by doves and other sorts of birds and hawks and so on. He has this vision of an angel playing a musical instrument, and he feels that his heart is pierced by the beauty of this sound that reminds him of the love of God. And then at the far end over there, a work by Stanley Spencer. Stanley Spencer is a kind of quirky English artist, wonderful artist, who paints his father, who's gone out into the farmyard to feed the chickens and the ducks and so on, And while he's looking at his dad, he has this moment of epiphany where his father sort of becomes St Francis. So his dressing gown, his brown dressing gown, becomes St Francis' habit. And you see him throw his arms as though he's also singing in praise of God, as we just see in this painting over here. Now, some of you might be wondering, what the heck is this tree doing here, right in the middle of the room? The elephant in the room, big tree in the room. Well, it might be interesting to hear what you think about this tree in the middle of the room. I know what I think it means, and I know why I brought it into the exhibition. I'll just say this, the artist who made this work, he's a living artist, he's very, very celebrated. He's called Giuseppe Hennone, and he's one of the leading figures in an art movement called Arte Povera, which translates into English poor art. Which doesn't mean poor means poor in quality, it means that it works with very modest, humble materials, so with earth, with stones, with trees. And this particular artist works with trees, and what he's done here is he's sort of carved out the interior of the tree to reveal a sort of younger tree or smaller tree inside the older tree. So this is a great big cedar, probably 150 years old, something like that. And then inside it is this young, lively tree, which is almost like the soul of the tree. It's the interior life, it's the spirit of the tree, sort of contained within the form of the big tree. So I think he's inviting us to kind of look beyond external appearances and to be aware that there's a life inside, and that life inside needs to be nourished and looked after. And also he talks about this door, so it's as if you can walk through this tree, almost passing from one realm to another, so you can pass almost from the earthly realm to the heavenly realm. So it's suggesting lots of different things. And when we spoke to the artist, we said to him, but do you recognize that there's some sort of Franciscan inspiration in this work? And initially he was a little bit uncertain whether that was the case, but as he talked about his own childhood, he lived up in the mountains above Turin. He was very familiar with the rituals and the rites of the Catholic Church, the processions, this sense that God often reveals himself in mysterious places, in the wilderness, in the forest, on the mountain and so on. So all of this sort of came together for him, and by the end of the conversation he was saying, yes, well I do, of course, recognize that there's a Franciscan inspiration in the work I do. Look at the wolf over there in that picture. There, this is the wolf some years later, compared to the picture where we saw him. He's become a sort of honorary citizen of Gubbio. He's become a sort of mascot for the town. And in fact, if you look very carefully, he's even got a halo. Who's ever seen a wolf with a halo? But there he is, the wolf of Gubbio, now fully integrated into the life of the town of Gubbio. And there's the local butcher who's giving him something to eat, and the little child is stroking the wolf, not something that they would have done a few years earlier. So in a sense, this is the outcome of Francis' intervention in the life of the little town of Gubbio. So just a few works that sort of suggest and allude to Francis' relationship with the natural world, and this is part of Francis' attraction for our times. We become very concerned about the state of the world, we become very concerned about the state of the planet and the sense of responsibility that we need to have towards what Pope Francis calls our common home. And Francis has been adopted as the patron saint of environmentalism, the patron saint of the concern that we should have for the world around us, but not just the world around us. I mean, the people around us, and that sense of human beings being one big family who have a big responsibility towards one another under the protection of a loving Father. Right, let's move on into. And these objects enable us to tell a story. They tell us stories, but also they take us back to Francis's time. And perhaps the most remarkable object in this robe is what you see here in this vitrine. Because in this case, we're not talking about a work of art, a painting, a sculpture. We're actually talking about one of Francis's own habits. So Francis inhabited this robe that you see here. This is part of his vital history. This takes us right back not only to Francis's time, but to Francis's person as well. Francis wore this robe as he crisscrossed central Italy and as he preached the good news in all the villages that he visited. So it's a work that takes us back not just in time to the time of Francis and to the person of Francis, but it takes us back also to Francis's spirituality, Francis's way of living the Christian faith, which is a very radical rejection of anything that can hold you back from pure and complete service of God. So Francis didn't want to own anything. He gave up all his possessions, just like we saw in that reference from the Gospel in St Luke. The only thing that Franciscan friars were permitted to own was their habit. That was the only thing that they were allowed to own. They weren't allowed to, even their prayer books they weren't allowed to own, only their habit. And Francis designs the habit in the shape of the Tau cross. And he says this, I want it made of poor material. I want you to look after it so it lasts you a long time. But also I want it to be of rough material so that when you wear it on your skin, you'll be constantly reminded of the passion of Christ, of the suffering of Christ. So you are inhabiting physically with your body the passion of Christ. You're living, as it were, inside the idea of the crucified Christ. This comes from the Franciscan community in Santa Croce in Florence, and you can imagine that for them it wasn't easy to agree to lend this to us. It's fine if it's a painting, it's fine if it's a sculpture, but to actually lend a very precious relic like this to a secular institution. I mean, the National Gallery is not a church, this is a secular museum. So to lend such a holy object, an object towards which reverence is due, to an exhibition in the National Gallery was not straightforward, not easy. In fact, just a few weeks before the exhibition opened, our Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, got in touch with me and said, Dear Dr. Finaldi, the Archbishop of Florence has written to me to say that an important relic from his diocese will be coming to my diocese. Now, I just need to be sure that you're going to properly look after it, that you're going to treat it with proper reverence. So I'm going to come and visit you, and you have to explain to me how you're going to display it. So my excellent assistant, where is she? I'll see you. She got in touch with the Cardinal, and she said, come and see Gabriele in the gallery. And I said, no, you don't tell the Cardinal to come here. I'll go and see him anyway. She'd already arranged it. So the Cardinal came over, and we had a long meeting where I explained to him everything that was going on in the exhibition. I explained exactly how we were going to display the relic. And fortunately, he was satisfied that it was going to be treated respectfully and reverently. And so he said, right, I can write to the Bishop of Florence and I can tell him that everything is okay. And so the relic can be packed up, put on the lorry and brought to London. So that's just the sort of practicalities around it. But I think we need to kind of recognise there's a kind of aura around this object. And I've asked Father Anthony if he'd do a prayer for us.
Of silence in our hearts, we cherish the divine peace as we meditate the life of St Francis. And we ask our Lord to make us be the channel of His divine shalom peace. God, our loving Father, we thank and praise you for giving us this privilege to be closer to the relic of St. Francis. And it tells us, it gives us that message that how much we need to do for the sake of your glory, to proclaim the news of your kingdom. We humbly ask you, Lord, to bless us all. Bless us with that divine strength to follow your ways. Bless us with the divine wisdom to understand your ways. We humbly ask you, Lord, to bless Gabriele and all those people who support them in this mission to bring your glory to people who meditate the life of St. Francis. We ask you, Lord, to bless Gabriele's wife, May, and his children, his family members. Loving God, we humbly ask you to bless us all. The wisdom, the blessings we receive today may remain with us always. We ask this through Christ, our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Can we sing?
Yes, of course.
Shall we sing, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace?
Yeah.
Make me a
Channel of your peace, where there is to let me bring your love, where there is injury, your pardon, Lord, where there is faith in you. O Master, let me never see. So much to be consoled, to console, to be understood, as to understand, to be loved, as to love with all my soul.
Lord Jesus Christ, you said to your apostles, Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. Look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church. Grant us peace, your blessings, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Father. By a very famous artist from the middle of the 20th century, an avant-garde artist working in an abstract style called Burri, B-U-R-R-I. He came from very near Assisi, and he made these paintings with sackcloth. And I think you can see the similarity between the sackcloth and the Franciscan habit. In fact, if you look at that red patch in the middle, it's almost as if he's wanting to allude to the stigmata as well. He would probably have said that this wasn't his explicit intention, but I think sort of deep down there's a clear association between what Alberto Burri was doing, and he's one of the sort of prophets of arte povera, poor art, that movement that I mentioned earlier. And as I said, he came from very close to Assisi. So, we wanted to make a connection between an innovative modern work of art and the habit of Francis as well. And then on the left-hand side is another painting by Zobra, the same artist we saw right at the beginning, in the very, very first room, with St Francis kneeling in prayer. There he is with his skull as he meditates on death and praise, which is as much a representation of his habit as it is of Francis himself. So this is the sort of habit section of the exhibition. And there's a section close to St Clare. You know that Clare was a little bit younger than St Francis. She was about 11 or 12 years younger than him. And she came from a very wealthy family. She was noble, actually, not like Francis himself. And she wanted to follow Francis' way of life. Her family was completely opposed to this. So one night she runs away from the family and goes to a place called Porciuncula. And there Francis, recognizing the authenticity of her calling, of her vocation, he welcomes her into the Franciscan family. He shaves her head, gives her the habit, and then eventually, of course, she settles in the Church of San Damiano that I spoke to earlier and becomes the founder of the Poor Clares. So Many of you will have heard of the Paul Clares. Well, the Paul Clares are the women Franciscans, and the rule of her order was written by St Clare herself, inspired by St Francis. It was the first rule for a religious order written by a woman. And then on this side here, this takes us back to Egypt. Do you remember I mentioned that Francis goes to Egypt in 1219? Francis deeply desired martyrdom. Okay, it sounds very strange to us. But many saints desire to give up everything they have, which means their blood as well, for love of God. And St Francis joined the crusade, probably in the hope that he would be martyred. Anyway, he wasn't martyred. He was, in fact, captured, and he was brought into the presence of the Sultan. And I mentioned before that this meeting, which should have been a meeting of intense hostility leading eventually to the death of Francis, in fact didn't. It was a very courteous, as I said, encounter between the leader of the Muslims and this important Christian figure who was St Francis. And at a certain point, the Sultan says to Francis, I think you'd better go, because I think you're convincing me to become Christian, and I think that's probably not a good thing for me in front of my people. So you should probably head back to your side. You should head back to your soldiers. And he gave him many gifts. Francis refused all the gifts, particularly the money. He didn't want money. He rejected outright. But he was allowed to take one gift. He did agree to take one gift, which is this object here. So Francis was given this ivory horn, because this horn would be a signal that he was being allowed through the enemy lines with the authority of the Sultan. And this object is kept in the treasury at Assisi and has been there since the beginning. And in a 14th century inventory, that's a list of the objects contained in the treasury at Assisi, it says that this ivory horn was given as a gift to St Francis by the Sultan of Egypt. There's some words inscribed on the silver awnings of this horn. While the inscription doesn't say that this horn was given to St Francis, what it does say is that St Francis used this horn to call people to prayer, and these sticks he beat together to call people to prayer. Well, that's not really a Christian tradition, is it? It's a Muslim tradition to call people to prayer with an instrument or through voice. So it seems very, very genuine, and we do know from tests that have been done on this object that it does date from the early 13th century. It may have been made in southern Italy, in Sicily, for example. That's where they tended to make these ivory horns, and then somehow reached the Sultan in North Africa. So right here we have sort of physical evidence of this important encounter between Francis and the Sultan. Now, in the 1980s, I think it was in 1987, Pope John Paul invited all the leaders of different religious faiths to come together, not in Rome, because Rome is very heavily Catholic and Christian. He said, come together in Assisi, which is the city of peace, and it's the city of St Francis. He gathered all together the leaders of the various faiths, the Jews, the Muslims, the Baths, and all the various other religions. And he said, it's time for us to come together and each of us serve God as we understand him in order to benefit the world. And we're going to do this in Assisi, and St Francis is going to be the patron saint of this gathering. So Francis, since then, has also acquired this status as patron saint of the dialogue between religions, which makes him, again, very, very important for our time. Think how much conflict there's been even in our own time because of religion. And Francis appears as a patron saint to help us along with this constant misunderstanding that we have between the faiths. Right, let's step into the last part of the show to you, because it's very dense and rich with content. But we have works of art from Italy, from France, from Spain, from Britain, from Germany, from Mexico, from Australia. These prints that you see here, magnificent, large-scale prints by an Australian artist called Arthur Boyd, showing episodes from the life of St Francis. different episodes from the ones that we've seen in the Sassetta paintings. But here, for example, this is a very striking one, this one here. This is after Francis has gone off to sell those wonderfully expensive fabrics, the velvets and the satins and so on, that his father traded in. His father is very upset and actually beats him up and throws him into the cellar, kind of locks him up. So this is a very violent rendition of the father of St Francis sort of attacking the poor boy. And then you might recognise one or two other kind of episodes in this suite of prints. But then you'll also find that Marvel Comics takes an interest in St Francis. So we have over here a Marvel comic from 1980 titled Francis, Brother of the Universe. You know, I mean, in Marvel, everyone's sort of master of the universe, or sort of conqueror of the universe, or whatever. But Francis is the brother, or servant of the universe. And this had an amazing print run. Nearly 1 million copies of this comic were made in 1980. And I think that just kind of demonstrates the huge fascination, the huge attraction that Francis has had, not just in history, but in our own time, a fascination which he continues to have. And of course, in the second half of the 20th century, we have cinema as well. And there's a whole suite of films devoted to St. Francis by, famous directors. This is Pasolini, the famous Italian Marxist filmmaker who devotes a film to St. Francis. The famous Zeffirelli film that you've all seen, Brother Sun, Sister Moon. And even in our own time, Wim Wenders. Some of you may have heard of Wim Wenders, a German filmmaker who did a very interesting film about Pope Francis, interviewed Pope Francis. He interspersed the interviews with Pope Francis with scenes from the life of St. Francis, which he himself directed, so right up until very recently. One of the excerpts that we've got here comes from a film where Mickey Rourke plays St. Francis. You may not be aware, but Mickey Rourke plays St. Francis. And Helena Bonham Carter plays St. Clair. So, this is not a sort of minority interest. I mean, this is absolutely kind of, mainstream actors, mainstream filmmakers taking an interest in St. Francis. Let's see what the next scene is, because I think the next one is a very striking one too.
Maybe during the holidays we can show in our Monday movies Brother, Son and Sister Moon in our parish.
Yes,
That
would be a good one.
Yeah.
This is a very curious film where these two, father and son, they're traipsing around Rome in modern times. So they don't have two pennies to rub together. And then miraculously they're transported back to St. Francis's time. And St. Francis instructs them to go and preach to the birds. So the film is about how they're going to preach to the birds. How do you preach to birds? Anyway, let me set the scene for this. So this is Francis after he's prayed on the mountain. He's in a tremendous crisis of faith. He's been crying out to God. He thinks God hasn't spoken to him. He's feeling completely alone. And he's crying out to God saying, "Speak to me, speak to me." And he wakes up in the morning and this is what he encounters. So at first he has no idea what's happening to him. And then all of a sudden it begins to dawn on him. and he starts shouting, God has spoken to me, God has spoken to me, through the visitation of the wounds on his body. So I'm going to tell you a little story, because the filmmaker who made this film is a woman called Liliana Cavani. She's made 3 films on St Francis. This is the second one. And she didn't really know how to do this scene. It's a very difficult scene to think of, because it's a sort of mystical experience, but it's also a physical experience. It can easily look ridiculous. It can look silly. It can look trite. So she said, okay, I've got an idea how I want to film the story. I'm going to get Mickey Rourke to play it for me. We're going to do it in 1 take. Then I'm going to gather all the crew at the end of the day. We're going to do a quick edit in the editing suite. And I'm going to show it to the whole crew. Now, if the crew don't like it, or if they start laughing, we'll abandon it. We'll do it differently. We'll do something else. And she said she gathered the crew at the end of the day. She showed them the film, and everyone was in tears in front of this scene. And so she said, okay, that's it. It's in the can. And that's how it went through to the finished film. This is the Zeffirelli film, and this is the moment when he strips off in front of the people of Assisi, and the Bishop of Assisi, who you see just behind him. That's his mother and father. Do you remember the scene we saw in Sassetta? This is Zeffirelli's kind of recreation of that very same scene, and the very same things happening here. It's mesmerising, isn't it? It really is. Beautifully done by Zeffirelli. So you might think this is a rather odd way to finish the show, but we began with works from from contemporary artists. And we finish with a work by a youngish German artist, Andrea Buchner. She's the one who did that big print with birds, with Francis preaching to the birds. And she just called this series of large prints, she's just called it Beggars. She doesn't give any kind of explanation as to what it's about. But what you can see is, you can see these hands which are outstretched, these hands raised, asking for attention, for love, for money, for support, whatever it might be. And she even represents the sort of hood as though it's a Franciscan cowl of a Franciscan habit. So it both picks up on the imagery of St Francis, but also on this idea of the poor are with you always. Francis's own desire to be identified with the poor, and you saw in the film he says he wanted to be poor like Christ was poor. When he says that Christ was a beggar, he doesn't mean that Christ went around begging. He says that Christ gave up everything he had, including the sort of dignity of being God. He gave up all of that. Christ himself says he has no place to lay his head. So he had no earthly possessions, and that's what Francis wanted to imitate. He wasn't particularly romantic about poverty. He didn't think poverty was a good thing in itself. But poverty was something to be aspired to because it brought you close to Christ. It was a way of imitating Christ. But of course the Franciscans, since the beginning, have been serving the poor, and that's what Francis did as well. He served the lepers, and the Franciscans have run hospitals, and they've run schools, and they've run food banks, and so on. So I think when you see this at the end of the show, I hope that you think about what you've seen up until now, and you'll be perfectly aware that you're going to encounter scenes like this just outside the door of the National Gallery. You don't have to go very far to find people who are in need, who are begging, and not just necessarily begging for money, who are begging for attention, affection, a kind word, or whatever. And in a way, that's what the show kind of leaves you with as you come to the end of the itinerary. So that's the end of the exhibition. I hope you've enjoyed it.